Now, what makes the sidereal zodiac different? They're both mathematically ideal circles of 360 degrees, divided up into 12 equal sections of 30 degrees that we call signs. Yes? The big difference is that the sidereal zodiac attempts to account for what's called the precession of the equinoxes, or axial precession. Now, what is that? Well, before we get into it, I just want to say a little bit about the difference between the tropical and the sidereal zodiacs, because I'm very passionate about this subject. And I really only use the tropical zodiac, and I'm going to explain why. So originally, the zodiac as we know it, as a mathematically ideal circle of 360 degrees, divided up into 12 each equal sections of 30 degrees we call signs, that came or emerged around 420 to 450 BCE, you see, in the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Yes? Now, the constellations that preceded the zodiac, or that are correlated with the zodiacal signs, go back even further. But what we call the zodiac didn't emerge until around 420 BCE. And we know this because there are no records of it before then. And we know that this came out of ancient Mesopotamia because we have the descriptions in what are called astrometric diaries, going back to around 600 BCE. I'm sorry, I have hair on my lip. It's either my own hair or cat hair. It's just ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You know what I mean? Even my cat hair has cat hair. But this is very important because we need to know where things come from. And the reason why I'm so adamant about this today is because yesterday I found some articles that claimed that the sidereal zodiac was 10,000 years old, or went back 10,000 years. There's no evidence that the constellations go back 10,000 years. Now, we do have evidence that ancient humans were tracking the movements of the moon and the lunar phases as far back as 30,000 years ago, because we have evidence. Like, there's these deer antlers that have lunar depictions etched into them, you see. And it's believed that they were tracking for menstrual purposes, you know. So it could have had something to do with fertility. So we do know that ancient humans were tracking celestial movements as far back as that. Why did I go out of focus? Focus, you motherfucker. Why am I blurry? It's like a Bigfoot video, you know? A close encounter of the blurred kind. So originally, the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac were the same thing. Because, you see, the solstices and equinoxes aligned with the cardinal signs and the cardinal points. The cardinal points, right, are the solstices and equinoxes. So the east is like Aries, you know, and the birth, sort of, you see. And then the south, you know, which we also refer to as like the highest point in the sky, the brightest point, the zenith of the year, you know, the summer solstice when the days are the longest, right? That was Cancer. Excuse me. And then Libra, of course, was the other equinox, the autumnal equinox. And Capricorn was assigned to the winter solstice. Yes. The Babylonians, the ancient Mesopotamians, had a solar lunar calendar. And so early on, with the emergence of the zodiac, signs were assigned to months. You see, this was the tropical year because it followed the solstices and equinoxes. Yes, the seasons, as opposed to the sidereal year, which tracked the movement of the stars themselves. And there's very little difference between the two. Now, what makes the sidereal zodiac different? They're both mathematically ideal circles of 360 degrees, divided up into 12 equal sections of 30 degrees that we call signs. Yes? The big difference is that the sidereal zodiac attempts to account for what's called the precession of the equinoxes, or axial precession. Now, what is that? Well, it was discovered by Hipparchus, the famous great Greek astronomer and astrologer, around 127 BCE. And basically, he noticed it because he was comparing his own astronomical data, that is, the positions of the stars and planets, right, relative to ancient Mesopotamian records from over 100 years prior. Yes. And he noticed that there was a very slight shift with the fixed stars and the zodiac, you see. So this is called axial precession. You see, because the Earth, let's say this is the Earth and this is the North Pole, right, is tilted on its axis. It's not a perfect sphere. And you see, over the period of 26,000 years, this axis moves and creates, right, it draws a circle in the sky, right? That's axial precession. So right now, you see the North Pole is pointed at Polaris, and that's the North Star, you see? That's Polaris. But during the time of the ancient Egyptians, when the pyramids were being built, which I think was like around 2500 BCE, don't quote me, but that's pretty close, it would have been Thuban that was the pole star, you see? And in the future, I believe it will be Vega, you see? So the precession of the equinoxes is a very important astronomical phenomenon. However, the way it's calculated, especially in Vedic astrology, because the sidereal zodiac became very prominent and a staple in the practice of the Vedic astrological traditions. Now, it's really important to note some history here about Vedic astrology. The oldest Sanskrit text we have on Vedic astrology, that is horoscopic astrology, is called the Yavana Yadika. And its name literally means nativity according to the Greeks, right? And it dates back to around the 2nd century CE, right? Or AD, for those of you who aren't familiar with the new scientific nomenclature. In the scheme of things, that's not very old, since the zodiac itself came out of ancient Mesopotamia at 420 BCE, or thereabouts, right? So now there's a document or a text in Sanskrit called the Jyotisha, the Vedanga Jyotisha. I don't know if I'm saying that correct. I'm an autodidact. The Vedanga Jyotisha, something like that. But it's an astronomical text, along with religious symbolism that it ties to it. But there's nothing akin to horoscopic astrology in it, right? That came out of ancient Mesopotamia. And we know this from records, right? Even the ancient Greek astronomer Eudoxus, around 400 BCE, give or take, right? Just after the invention of the zodiac, he famously said that the Chaldeans, ancient Mesopotamians, Babylonians, whatever, it was a very mixed sort of society of lots of different city-states in ancient Mesopotamia. But at the time, it was dominated by the Babylonians, or the Neo-Babylonian Empire, you see. And Eudoxus said they had an amazing skill and talent for using the stars, right, astronomical movements, in order to discern or divine someone's future events or the contents of their character. Yes. It was already sort of renowned at that time, you see. Now, ancient Egypt also factored in heavily to this. And why is this really important? Why would Vedic astrologers have a text called Yavaniyataka, which meant nativity according to the Greeks, when we know that astrology first came out of ancient Mesopotamia. The reason is someone named Alexander of Macedon, who you may know more as Alexander the Great, right? Now, he was Macedonian, right, from the area around Greece, and he conquered a huge swath of land, stretching from the Mediterranean in the west, right, all the way down in the south to ancient Egypt, and then in the east, all the way to India, or at least parts of India, or what we now know as India. And so what happened there? It's something we call syncretism, which is religious and cultural exchange between different societies, right? So we had, the Greek culture mixing with the Egyptian culture and even with the Indian culture, you see? This was a very fertile melting pot. And we call this the Hellenistic Age, right? It goes from 423 BCE, the conquest of Alexander the Great, to about 3 to 400 CE or AD, after the rise of Christianity, you see, or Christianity becoming the dominant ideology, right? And Christianity sort of represented, what word should I use? Christianity represented an antidote, if you will, to the ancient ideas of fate that astrology promoted, right? The idea was that you had this fate that was indicated by your birth chart, and there was only so much you could do to change it, essentially. That was called remediation, or we call it that now. And in ancient times, it entailed going and praying at the shrines of gods and goddesses in order to appeal to them to sort of finagle your fate in a bit more advantageous direction. But back to India, yes? Because horoscopic astrology didn't appear in the Vedic culture until later, until the 1st or 2nd century. And a lot of it had to do with syncretism, you see, which is what we call, as I said earlier, the religious and cultural exchange. So an example of syncretism is the mixture of the ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian cultures. Yes? So the Greek god Hermes, who was the god of, writing, communication, yes, knowledge, and all those sorts of things, became conflated with the Egyptian god Thoth, who was the god of the occult, also writing and script and, all these sorts of things. So, and that gave rise to what? The mythical character that we now call Hermes Trismegistus. And there were lots of ancient astrological texts that were attributed to him. Yes? But there's no proof he actually existed. In fact, the proof says that he was actually a product of syncretism. Yes? And the conflation of different cultures. Now it gave rise to a whole new sort of a mixture of ideologies that really underpinned astrology, right? For example, Platonism and Plato. You see, I believe Plato goes back to around 400 BCE, or maybe 3. I know, please don't quote me on that. I don't want to say incorrect information. I know Pythagoras goes back to 500 BCE, right? As does the Buddha, right? And actually, Buddhism came to ancient Greece from India, you see? That's the syncretism once again. Now, it was also during Hellenistic times, right? So after 400 BCE. But you see, Buddhism was very much aligned with many aspects of Platonism. It's very, very interesting. But what does all this have to do with the sidereal zodiac? Well, it looks like following Hipparchus discovering precession, somehow that idea of tracking the sidereal movements came to India. And you see, Western astrology has gone through so many metamorphoses. It's sort of developed and changed a lot. Whereas Vedic astrology remained pretty well intact for many, many years, hundreds of years, centuries, because it was tied to the religious practices in the Indian traditions, in the Indian culture. However, you may be aware of a little movement that I rail on about quite a bit, known as theosophy. You see, that was started by Madame Blavatsky in the late 1800s, following the spiritualist movement, right, which we know was sort of a fraud and a scam in retrospect. And I maintain that theosophy was pretty much a scam too. And that Madame Blavatsky, its founder, was a girl boss, a girl boss that got really adept at, swindling people. Now, in in the late 1800s and early 1900s, theosophy, the theosophical movement, became a big deal. It became a strong force. Yes, it sought to bridge the teachings of the East and the West, sort of like a resurgence of syncretism. However, this was a lot more insidious to me because it happened under the under the guise, you see, of colonialism. Hi, cat. Of colonialism, you see? So it was sort of like Western culture was appropriating all these Eastern cultures and really only at a cursory look and not even representing them in their proper context and misrepresenting their doctrines and their ideas. It looks like the sidereal zodiac in practical use came to India from the West, as did horoscopic astrology in general. At least that's what the evidence suggests, the textual evidence. So anyway, the religious tradition of India kept those things really well intact. But as I was saying before, theosophy intervened because it sought to bridge the teachings of the East and the West. And of course, under the guise of colonialism, right? The British had colonized India. India was a colony of England, you see, at the time. And the Theosophical Society and theosophy in general, including Madame Blavatsky, sort of fetishized Eastern cultures, like Hinduism and the Indian tradition, which is very rich and varied. It's not a monolith, as well as Buddhism. Yes, they were very much into the Eastern philosophies. And once again, they sort of misrepresented the history, which we now know a lot better, but wasn't quite known in Victorian times. So really what she did is she sort of packaged together a misunderstanding of Western philosophies like Platonism, along with her misunderstanding or misrepresentation of both Buddhism and Indian philosophy, you see? And she sort of made up a lot of history and brought in a lot of Victorian race science. So you see, theosophy was a big influence on high-level Nazis like Heinrich Himmler, which is, again, pretty wacky. I'm not a big fan of a lot of theosophy because it goes against the historical record, and it's very racist, But anyway, what happened following the Theosophical movement, or the founding of the Theosophical Society, is that the headquarters were put in India. But the granddaddy of modern astrology, Alan Leo, was also a theosophist. Yes? In fact, he was a high-level theosophist who brought modern astrology to India, including, right, the outer planets and what we now call the 12-letter alphabet. The misunderstanding that the house meanings, the meaning of the astrological houses, come from the signs, which it doesn't. That's not true. They're places in the sky, right? But that's a whole nother discussion for another time. Suffice it to say that Westerners who fetishized Eastern cultures came back after they appropriated them to mess up those cultures, right? And it was very palatable to India. Yes? Even Gandhi credits theosophy, right? And its head at his time, who was Annie Besant, who was also English. He credited her with being the force behind Indian independence and the person who first got him to read the Bhagavad Gita, and to reconnect with his Indian past, right? And we know that, he was one of the instrumental characters in Indian independence. Yes? And a lot of that came from Indian nationalism and an appeal to Hindu nationalism, which theosophy and Western astrology also seem to feed into. This idea of Indian supremacy or whatever, which we now see, in politicians in India like Narendra Modi, who, espouse these ideas that all of humanity came out of India, right? Which isn't historically accurate and doesn't fit the biological record. And you might be asking yourself, what does this all have to do with the sidereal zodiac? Once again, Saturn girl, it's because Indian astrology had been heavily influenced by the West, not only in Hellenistic times, but also in the 19th century and the 20th century, you see? So a lot of these practices got ingrained into it and carried over. I'm not sure when the sidereal zodiac became the staple in Indian society or Indian astrological culture, but it had to have been after 127 BCE, when precession was discovered by Hipparchus. Now, what's very interesting, so once again, we can see historically that these claims about sidereal astrology being older than tropical, let alone 10,000 years old, are completely false. In fact, as we just talked about, the sidereal and tropical zodiacs were the same thing because no one had accounted for precession. However, according to one of my favorite archaeologists, Dr. David Miano, who teaches at my former employer, University of California, San Diego, he points out that the cardinal signs during the Sumerian period, around 3000 BCE or 3200 BCE, those cardinal signs would have been the fixed signs. So Aquarius, right? Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio. Those would have been the cardinal points. But again, that was long before the zodiac emerged. The oldest references we have to the constellations which correlate with the zodiac, right? Because the zodiac itself isn't defined by the constellations, it's defined by the solstices and equinoxes. And we'll get to that in just a minute, of course. But we know historically that they were the same thing, and that the difference came out of trying to account for precession, which even in Indian astrology, there's competing ways to do it. There's calculations that we call Ayanam says. I think I'm saying that correctly. Ayanam says. And these are calculation methods to sort of determine where we are in the zodiac compared to the fixed stars, right? The idea in sidereal astrology is that it lets the zodiac drift relative to the fixed stars and the solstices and equinoxes, right? And we talked about what axial precession is, yes? We talked about where the Earth's axis, right? What am I doing it? Where the Earth's axis precesses and draws that little circle in the sky, right? And what that means is that over time, a different astrological sign occurs during the spring equinox. So hence the precession of the equinoxes. And it goes in reverse, right? It goes clockwise as opposed to counterclockwise, right? So presumably we were in the age of Aries at a certain point, in the BC time, BCE. And then supposedly the equinox entered Pisces, around, the beginning of the Common Era. And that's where the idea of astrological ages come from. I used to be all into that shit. The Aquarian Age and all that was popularized by Madame Blavatsky and the New Age movement. But I don't really get into that stuff anymore. It's not really important. And the reason is, the primary reason why I don't use the sidereal zodiac, which is because it lets it lets the zodiac drift relative to the solstices and equinoxes. So by the time we get to the year 18,000 or 8,000, by the year we get to, by the time we get to the year 8,000, you'd have Geminis being born in winter time, We'd be, just get me for now. I will get to you. What sign is my cat? I don't fucking know. They're named Castor and Pollux after the brothers of Gemini. An ex-girlfriend named them. But she named them after the movie Face Off, you see. So the primary reason why I don't like the sidereal zodiac is because it lets the the signs drift relative to the cardinal points, the solstices and equinoxes. Why do I think that's stupid? Because we fixed the cardinal signs to the cardinal points back when the zodiac emerged. Back when it first came out. You see? And the symbolism of the zodiacal signs primarily comes from two places. Number one, the planets that rule them. And number two, their place in the solar cycle, right? The alternation between light and dark over the course of a solar year. That alternation, that cycle, yes? The seemingly unchanging cycle of the solstices and equinoxes are what define the zodiac. Because the zodiac isn't a real thing. It's not the constellations themselves. It has nothing to do with the astronomical width or whatever size of the constellations. Right? It's a mathematically ideal circle. Yes? And so the zodiac itself is conceptual. We use it and we find meaning in it because how we've developed it over thousands of years, right? At least 14 to 1500 years, yeah. And the history of astrology goes back even further, right? To at least 1000 BCE, when we first find evidence of these constellations that are correlated with the zodiac. Right, from ancient Mesopotamian documents, like the oldest star catalog in the world, which is known as Mul Apin. And it contains astronomical data going back to 1000 BCE. But we have all 12 of the zodiacal constellations enumerated in there with their current symbolism. That's amazing. That's a long fucking time ago. Even though people want to claim that it's even older. Like, why? This is fucking wild enough. This is cool enough. You see what I'm saying? So anyway, the solar cycle helps define the zodiac. For example, Libra. Part of the meaning of Libra is the fact that it's at the autumnal or fall equinox, right? Equal night and equal day. Right? This is the choice between light and dark, right? Where we make free choice, the decision of Libra, yes? The decision of Libra to descend into the underworld, where the nights become longer than the days, you see? In Scorpio, you see? In Scorpio. And I'll be done speaking in just a second, okay? And then I'll get to your fucking charts. But people wanted to know about this. And I hope it's interesting to you, because this is fundamental astrology. You see, the alternation between light and dark is the essence of astrology. It's the basis for all its fucking meaning. If you can't understand that most basic point, that astrology is about light and dark, look at the chart here. You see the ascendant-descendant axis? Let me go to this thing. You see the ascendant-descendant axis here? That's the horizon when you were born. This was the eastern horizon. And the sign that was rising up over it as you took your first breath is your rising sign, which in this case was Libra for this chart. You see? And then the midheaven, right? MC stands for Medium Coeli. Yeah? That was the highest point in the sky when you were born. So all this stuff that was above the horizon, right? This new moon here, this Venus, Mercury, Saturn, and Jupiter, these were all visible when this person was born. And everything, right? And we called it the south, yes? The high point in the sky. And then everything down here, right, is called the north. All that was invisible. It was on the dark side of the earth when this person was born. You see, this notion of light and dark is the most essential and important thing in all of astrology. We call it sect, and it determines your best and worst planets. These are more things for a lesson later. But it's important when you're talking about sidereal astrology, because when you let the signs drift relative to the solstices and equinox points, then you're going to have all these signs move. And you're going to lose what? The whole symbolism. If you let Libra drift relative to the equinox, the autumnal equinox, it loses its meaning, right? The meaning of Capricorn comes from the fact that it's ruled by Saturn, right? The furthest visible planet, the coldest, darkest, right? And Capricorn was the coldest, darkest month of the year, the winter solstice, when the days are the shortest and the nights are the longest. And that's partly where its symbolism comes from too, not just Saturn, but the fact that it's at the winter solstice, the place of death, right? Death and resurrection. And that's a lot of where Capricorn gets its symbolism, you see. The same with Aries. The fact that it's at the vernal or spring equinox gives it a lot of meaning. Gemini, right? Look at the sign. I'm a Gemini, right? Gemini's leading up to what? Gemini's leading up to the the summer solstice, isn't it? In terms of the calendar, it's leading up to the summer solstice, the bright spot of the year. So Gemini is ruled by Mercury, but it also is known for its youthfulness, right? Optimism, going outward, right? When a sign occurs between Aries and Cancer, you know, that's the waxing cycle. Or really, you could say from Aquarius to Cancer. That's the waxing cycle. You see? That's the waxing cycle. Well, and someone just asked about Jupiter. So, and by the waxing cycle, I mean that the sun is approaching, right? It's leaving the winter solstice and approaching the summer solstice. Whereas the waning cycle is the sun leaving the summer solstice and then thereby approaching the winter solstice. Yes? And this, we could see the symbolism of this alternation between light and dark in the religions and spiritual traditions of many ancient cultures, right? So I won't get into all that, of course. That's a video for another time. But then, for example, someone asked Sagittarius. Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, right? And it's the sign immediately before the winter solstice. So you see, Sagittarius has an optimism, doesn't it? You know, it's right around the holiday season when people were, you know, imbibing and getting fucked up and shit like that. You know? But the winter solstice was a festival, a holy time for many ancient cultures, right? Because everyone could see the fucking solstice, you know, in ancient societies. So anyway, you see, this is why sidereal, it doesn't make sense to me in horoscopic astrology, because it rejects or dismisses all of that meaning of the solar cycle. The zodiac is defined by the seemingly unchanging rhythm of the solstices and equinoxes. Yes, we know that it's changing over time because we know about axial precession. However, the zodiac isn't tied to that because it's not tied to the fixed stars or constellations. You can look at fixed stars being, you know, conjunct a particular planet or angle. That's very important. But the zodiac isn't defined by the constellations or the fixed stars. Otherwise, you know, all the signs would be the size or reflect, right, those constellations, and they aren't. Right, they're ideal sections of 30 degrees off of a 360-degree circle. Yes? So once again, the reason why I think the sidereal zodiac is useless in horoscopic astrology is because it loses the symbolism, or one of the primary sources of the symbolism for each zodiacal sign, as we just talked about. The tropical year and the tropical zodiac are tied to the seasons. But really, by that we mean the solstices and equinoxes. And that's the basis for the symbolism underlying astrology. So I hope that's useful and meaningful for you all. Thank you for watching. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. And make sure to click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, saturngirl.org. And if you can't afford a reading right now, come to my live streams and get one for free. But you have to be subscribed to get notified about them. And please consider tipping me. It helps me make such wonderful content. You can give through super thanks below or become a member of my channel. And remember, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful, whatever it is you're having.